Welcome to So Very Easy. My name is Laura, and today let's make a very quick cathedral window pincushion, and let's make it with no hand sewing. Well, except for the button. The pincushion takes 3 fabrics. We have the main fabric, which we see on both sides, and it is cut at 8.5 inches. The little trim piece, which we only see a little bit of, is also cut at 8.5 inches. This little piece that peeks out through those little windows needs to be cut at 6 inches. And to help us get this all together as quickly as we can, we're going to use a little bit of glue along with our stitching. That little inside piece is cut at 6 inches, and we need to turn it over and press a seam allowance at 1/4 inch. Once it's pressed, run a line of glue right along that edge and press it down. And that way we don't have to worry about any of those edges poking out. Once that little center piece has been pressed over, we're going to be able to stitch the 2 8.5 inch squares together. We want right sides touching, and before we do that, we need to cut a hole in the center of the fabric that is going to be this little border piece. In my case, it's the red. So I'm just going to pick up that fabric and cut a hole in the center. That hole will be used after we do the stitching. Place right sides together and stitch 1/4 inch all the way around. Now I would recommend taking your machine and making the stitches a little bit smaller, right up to a size 2. I like to start at one edge and then stitch all the way around, finishing at the edge. And that leaves my corners nice and clean. Trim that seam allowance to about 1/8 inch. Now you can use a rotary cutter and cut along the edge, or a pair of scissors. We only need a very small seam allowance, and that will make this turn over easier. Once that seam allowance has been trimmed down, we're going to be able to turn this right side out. And we have the hole to do it. If the hole's too small, you can make it bigger, because this piece will cover that hole. Turn this little cushion right side out and poke out those corners. Once those corners have been poked out, we're going to be able to press this flat. And be sure to pull those seams out as tight as you can so there's no little dimple inside that seam, and press that flat. Once it's well pressed, we can put on this little center piece. We need to find the center at the 4-inch mark on all 4 corners to make sure that we are not twisting this. We can now pin these layers together. Once it's pinned down, we need to stitch around this center piece, but we need to leave a little bit of an opening on one side. So start in that seam and go all the way around, stopping within the seam. So we have about a 2-inch opening, and stitch as close as you can to this edge. So I have a little opening and all of my layers are stitched together. This little opening is where we're going to be able to put the fiber fill inside. And after it's stuffed, we need to reclose this off. In order to know exactly where to put this fabric, just draw a line. You're not going to see the line after it's been stitched, so you can use something that you definitely can see. And that is going to be a matching line after. We're going to do these rolled edges next, and we get to do it from the back side. This little edge needs to be rolled from that point to the corner and make this little curve. So we will have a curve on each of those sides. The points stay flat and the center piece stays flat. This just needs to come up. And this is easier if we do it at the iron and glue that edge down. A trick to turning this over is to put a pin in the corner and a pin right at this center part. And that way when you pull this over, the points will stay nice and pointy, and you can manipulate this fabric to roll it over. Put a little bit of glue and then iron that dry. From here we can go to the next part and continue pinning each of the centers and that corner as you pull that back and glue it. So this is the shape that we are looking for. Give it a good press And now we can go to the machine and stitch. And we want to stitch along the edge that's closer to the inside. And I would recommend starting on one edge, stitching, and coming off the second edge. And when you do, leave a long tail of thread. So you will have 4 threads coming out of each of these corners. So I've started with a long tail of thread and have stitched down and ended with a long tail of thread. Started with a long tail of thread and stitched. So each corner will have 4 long threads. We're going to be using those threads to tie the center. And take this to the iron and give it a good press, making sure there's no wrinkles, because this is the last chance we'll have to press it. We now get to stuff this pillow part, but we need to make sure we get stuffing nice and tight in each of those corners. If we miss the corners, they're going to be flat, and we want the corners nice and full. So stuff this pillow really well. Once this is well stuffed, we need to close up this end. We could take this batting and move it out of the way and match that line that we drew to the edge of the fabric. By drawing that line previously, we now can make sure that this is a straight seam. And just close up that seam with the machine. Once that seam has been stitched, we can manipulate the stuffing to make sure it's all even. With these long ends that we kept, we're going to be able to bring them to the front and tie the points together. You might find it easier if you pin the flaps down so those points touch. It's just easier to tie the knot. Now we're going to be able to pull the next 2 over, pinning those points together and tie the knot with the next threads. And the pincushion is done, except for that button, but we're going to be able to use these threads to sew the button on. Divide the thread into 2 portions. We're going to need to get a nice fat needle that has a big end so we can thread all of these threads into that needle. So I'm going to take the end of that needle and put in all 4 of those threads. Now I can thread my button right onto that needle, put the needle right down through, right to the back side. Place the needle back inside, just leaving a little bit of a space. And we're going to come right up to the underside of the button. Pull that through. So that button has been secured on with 4 strong threads. We can take the needle off and pull the thread tight so the button sinks inside. From here, we get to tie these 2 threads together. To prevent the thread from pulling back out, twist it around the back of the button once, and then tie your knot. Do a second or a third knot, whatever you feel comfortable doing. We can now trim off the threads. And that's all there is to making the Cathedral pincushion. And this pincushion ends up being about 5.5 inches square. The back is done, the sides are done, there's no raw seams, no hand stitching except for that little button. Think of all the different fabrics you could do this with. The pincushion is now done. We still have that space underneath each arm, and that button really toughs it in. I do hope you've enjoyed my technique on making the Cathedral window pincushion flat style. And thank you for joining me today on Sew Very Easy. Feel free to subscribe, and as always, come on back. Let's see what we're sewing next time in the sewing room. Bye for now.